Chapter 1. I am led forth. In sleep of helpless infancy, trees were the arms that cradled me. On tree my daily food is spread. Tree is my chair, and tree is my bed. Teresa Hooley. I was born in the country in a house on a sunny hill on the fringe of a pine wood in the south of Hampshire. Beacon Hill it was called because just above the house there had been the old telegraph station with high wooden arms which signaled the messages in 12 minutes between the Admiralty in London and Portsmouth. As soon as I could walk, I used to sit in a sunny spot on the pine needles and listen to the soft sounds of the wind in her makeshift leaves. It was like music to me. When I was 2, I had my first little garden. The first things I grew were nasturtiums, and soon after that, with the help of my nanny, I scratched my name in the soil and sowed white mustard seed. A week later, I was proud to spell out the letters of a green Richard. At 4, with the help of a larch that grew in the wood, I was proud of my flagpole, which I had barked and painted myself. It was the center of the little garden. Each morning I hoisted a flag, and each evening I took it down, carefully rolled it up, and tied it correctly, ready to hoist and break the next day. At the entrance of my little garden, I stuck 2 withies and made an arch just big enough to allow me to pass under it. In a month's time, to my great delight, they started to grow leaves. It was a great thrill, for until then I had not grown anything more ambitious than nasturtiums and mustard. When I was given a wheelbarrow, I used to collect leaves from an oak wood at the end of the garden. I dug a little pit up to my waist and gradually filled it with layers of leaves, covering this with road scrapings and stable manure from our pony, and finally topped it with inverted slabs of turf. I watched my father bud roses in the summer and graft pears and apples in the winter. He allowed me to tie buds in with wet raffia grass from an iron bowl. I became quite an expert at this, and soon I was allowed to prepare the bud myself. If the graft on an apple stock had not taken, there was a chance to bud it later. I loved doing this and vied with the gardeners in getting the best results. On Saturday evenings, instead of playing cricket, as a great treat, I was allowed to help my father sow tree seeds in long narrow beds I had helped to make. As the little pine seedlings came up, they wore a little cap, which they seemed to be raising in salute. I was fascinated by the regiments of tiny seedlings, and I protected, weeded, and watered them. Their care was more important to me than any game. At the age of 4, I used my father's tool, and my first effort in carpentering was to make a soapbox for my mother, used for many years in the scullery sink, and afterwards for further years at the stables. My forebears had originally lived in Kent, having been granted lands by Henry I, who married off one of his paramours to a young knight. For generations, Sissinghurst Castle was the Baker home until it was commandeered and used as an internment camp for French prisoners of war, who eventually burnt it down. It was then that family were scattered, and my branch went to live at Cawston in Norfolk. The Bakers, who came from Normandy, frequently intermarried with the St Barbes, who came from Brittany. Generations of St Barbes lived at Broadlands, Romsey, until it was sold to Lord Palmerston in Victorian times. I was interested to find in the Pembroke College Library a family entry on page 128 of Vin Aluni Cantabriginis, Volume 1, Part 2. Richard Baker admitted at Pembroke, March 7, 1758, son of Richard Baker, Esquire, of Yarmouth, Norfolk, born there, matriculated, Michaelmas, 1758, scholar, B.A. 1762, M.A. 1765, D.D. 1778, fellow 1763, ordained priest, London, February 19, 1769, rector of Great Poringland, Norfolk, the poet, Gray and one of the 3 fellows of the college who witnesses the signing of Gray's will, July 2nd, 1770. Author of the Harmony or Argument of the Four Evangelists in 4 parts, the Psalms of David Evangelized, died April 16th, 1818, age 77, father of Richard 1790, volume 2, 309, gave the picture by Verrocchio in the chapel. This beautiful sacred painting is of Joseph of Arimathea claiming the body of Christ being taken down from the cross. It forms the reredos behind the communion table in the college chapel. His son Richard Baker was admitted to Pembroke at the age of 16, June 30th, 1790, as Baker, Richard, son and heir of Richard, 1758, clerk, D.D., rector of Cawstone, Norfolk, born there, matriculated Michaelmas, 1791, scholar, B.A., 1795, M.A., 1800, ordained deacon, Norwich, February 2nd, 1796, priest, December 22nd, 1799, rector of Botley, Hants, 1802-54, died December 5th, 1854, aged 81 years, at Botley, father of the next, James Scott, 1822, and John Thomas Wright, 1830, and Stephen C., 1833. As a boy, I was told my great-grandfather, rector of Botley, Hampshire, for 52 years, who was one of the old-fashioned type of sporting parson. He used to wear a pink coat under a black gown, and he encouraged sport of every kind. He thought nothing of riding the 70 miles to London for a luncheon engagement, returning the next day. In order to promote the noble art of self-defense, a barrel of home-brewed beer was rolled out of the rectory on a Sunday afternoon in support of the local champion who would challenge all comers from Portsmouth. He was a good boxer himself, as 2 highwaymen discovered on evening when they tried to relieve him of the money he was carrying home for his servants' wages. It was 2 footpads to one old man and a dog, and the rector was attacked from front and back. But he got the better of his assailants, and with the help of his dog, he marched them to the Bargate at Southampton. Then he walked home to Botley, arriving at the rectory cool and unperturbed, though his white shirt front was covered in blood. A former scholar and fellow of Pembroke College, Cambridge, he had earlier exchanged his living at Cawston in Norfolk for the one at Botley. He drove the whole 200 miles in the family coach, borrowing horses at various stages until he reached his new rectory. Then the coach was left in a paddock where it became family mansion for generations of free-ranging cocks and hens. Great-grandfather Baker is buried in the family vault at the west end of Botley Church. It is an ornate affair with a pointed pillar bearing the family coat of arms. The present rector, the Reverend Duke Baker, told me that once when the Sunday school was leaving the church, one little fellow pointed to the vault and asked, "Is that where Jesus was buried?" His eldest son, my great-uncle Richard, was a scholar too and coached his brothers for Cambridge. For a while, he farmed the 800-acre Glebe farm for his father, riding once a year to Norfolk to collect rent from tenants on the family estate. Then he decided upon a more adventurous life, so he went out to Ontario, Canada, where he cleared the bush and shot wild bear. His nearest neighbor, George, lived 7 miles away, and on Sunday afternoons it was Richard's custom to ride over to visit his friends. As a boy of 10, I used to find it thrilling to listen to letters read to me by my father, which he too had enjoyed as a 10-year-old. Long passages of these letters dealt with philosophical and religious questions, often in an introspective vein, but every now and then there would be a spicy bit about bears. It was then that I sat up and really took notice. One incident stands out in my memory. George told Richard how one night he heard an alarming noise coming from the yard. Pulling a sheepskin coat over his nightshirt, he went out into the yard, and there was a big black bear struggling to lift his prize hog over the sty. He had no rifle or gun with him, so he seized a spade and with one mighty blow laid the bear's skull open with the edge, killing it. It fell dead at his feet. Dead at his feet! I kissed my mother and said good night to her and my father. Looking out from my bedroom window, I could see my young trees in the moonlight. I searched in all directions, but there was not even a shadow that remotely resembled a bear. I will go to Canada one day, I thought, where I can kill bears with spades. Richard's brother was John Thomas Wright Baker, my grandfather. He went to Clare Hall, now Clare College, and, like his father, became a parson. He did duty at the Hampshire parishes of Botley, Durley, Sholing, and West End, where he lived in his own house with a large tree-surrounded garden. Like Nelson's Admiral Collingwood, he would tuck acorns in the hedgerows along the fields of his parish. 70 years afterwards, many of the resulting fine oaks were felled to build the little rescue ships of the war. He was a great walker. It is recorded that he once walked 42 miles before breakfast on a pint of beer and always undertook his pastoral visits on foot, except on Sundays when he was driven in a brougham. He was also a trained athlete and excelled at both high and long jump. Sometimes when my father and grandmother were driving in the chase, they would meet my grandfather returning from some visit. For fun, he would start running backwards in front of the fast-trotting pony, and at every dozen strides or so would jump backwards over his walking stick. He had a reputation as an eloquent reader, and rich and poor would fill his churches to hear him bring to life the ancient characters of Scripture for their enlightenment and enchantment. It seems that in his church views he was led towards evangelicalism by his forebear, that author of the penitential psalm of David. He could not abide sacerdotalism and avoided using the word altar for the Lord's table, adhering strictly to the church's rubrics. A lifelong vegetarian, he considered the Lord's Supper a love feast of bread and wine among his close followers, as he believed the Master had meant it to be. His out-and-out evangelical attitude was frowned upon by his bishop, who wrote him a curt note on the subject. Being of a highly sensitive nature, he was so deeply shocked by this unchristian reproof that the blood rushed to his head, and he dropped dead. He was buried in the graveyard near the west door of the church at West End, where later my grandmother was buried too. My dear father, John Richard St Barbe Baker, the only child, was 14 at the time, and from then on his gentle mother, who had felt the blow most bitterly, became his responsibility. He devoted himself to her and to his woodlands, establishing forest nurseries and training and employing a number of men. He had been brought up to understand that the family money, which his Aunt Sarah had the use of during her lifetime, would ensure his independence. At the time of her last illness, he was spending his winter doing missionary work among the villagers of the mountains of southern France. In response to a telegram, he returned just in time to be with the old lady and comfort her in death. When the will came to be read, however, it was found that the family trustees had persuaded Aunt Sarah to leave most of the money to them. My father asked his lawyer cousin's advice, and they both took the view that it was God's will, and therefore little use throwing the matter into chancery. The trustees, who were brothers and also bankers, retired on Aunt Sarah's money. The senior one bought a mansion in the country, furnished and equipped with servants. On the very first morning after his arrival to take possession, the butler came into weather. He went over to the bed, where he found his new master dead. He telegraphed the brother, who at once caught a train from London. He asked the guard to stop at a halt near his brother's mansion so that he could take a short cut across the field. As requested, The train stopped. Nobody alighted, so the guard walked along the train to find the younger brother dead in his seat. My father agreed with his cousin that this looked like divine retribution, but the misdirected wealth still did not return to him, so he gave up all thought of living as a country gentleman and turned his hobby into his business. This was fortunate for me, for from my earliest childhood I became intimate with trees and nurseries. As a boy, my father had not followed the family tradition of going to Cambridge. He had instead a private tutor. At the age of 17, he became interested in the evangelical revival of the 80s of the last century, and under the influence of Archbishop Chenevix's Trench's daughter, devoted himself to God's work, volunteering to carry on when Miss Trench left the district. Though he was only 18, he filled the village reading room on Sunday afternoons and evening. Later, he built a mission hall seating 300 in his own garden. People from the surrounding villages came to this center, soon even missionaries from Africa and India. It was about this time that my father proposed to the only daughter of the squire. Charlotte Perrott had played the harmonium in her father's reading room and enthusiastically helped Miss Trench and John Baker with the mission services. It was she who had been Miss Agnes Weston's strong supporter when she founded her mission to seamen. Charlotte's father, who was the vicar's warden at West End, kept the best horses in that part of Hampshire and hunted with the Hursley and the New Forest staghounds. Although his daughter never hunted, he mounted her well. When my father asked her to marry him, she said that, fond as she was of him, she could not possibly marry him, as he would not be able to provide her with the kind of life she had been accustomed to enjoy. A few weeks later, her father lost his money in the Devil's Dyke Railway Company. Charles Perrott had believed in the Australian claimant in the Tykeborne case and, having promised his support, lost heavily when the case was not proved. He was perhaps 40 years ahead of his time in this venture. The combination of these unfortunate investments cost him his house and property at West End. Servants went, horses went, and his beautiful house, too. His daughter wrote to my father, "Dear John, my father has lost all his money. Please marry me." And he did. I was fortunate in having a charming grandmother who used to take me for walks to visit her old neighbors. Those were the days of polite calls and daintily served tea in china cups. One Tuesday afternoon, when we were calling upon her nearest neighbor, Mrs. Anderson, we found her distressed because she had lost a little tabby kitten. My grandmother mentioned that on Sunday evening a little stray kitten had come to the house. It had probably followed one of the maids to the mission hall. I had befriended it, and it had settled down and became one of the family. I was terribly afraid that I might have to give up my kitten, to which I had become very attached. Happily, Mrs. Anderson sensed my anxiety and asked me, "Do you love my little kitten very much?" I answered that I did, and so she generously said I might keep it. That was the first and last call that afternoon. I hastened home to make sure that my kitten was safe. I was now 4. My father was adding a couple of rooms to his house, and I spent much time with the carpenters. Having seen a funeral procession the week before, when my father had put on his frock coat and black silk hat, I was taken with the notion that if my pussy were to die, I must give her a proper funeral with a coffin. I made a box 2 feet long from ends of flooring. Even at that early age, I could use tools with precision and drive nails. I fitted a lid with leather hinges and tarred it inside and out, plastering myself at the same time. I remember my nanny making me rub butter on my hands to remove the black sticky stuff, before finally scrubbing my hands with soap and water. The kitten's coffin was put into the roof of the shed, where it stayed until the cowmen broke a leg off the milk stool. Then my black box served him instead for many years. My kitten lived to be 13 and in the end walked off into the wood. I always thought she had a secret burial place, but search as I might, I never found it. When I was 5, my father said, "You are getting a big boy now. This will make you strong." And he cut a slice of meat from the servant's joint. Although he was practically vegetarian himself, he provided a weekly joint for the cook and the housemaids. "Father, I don't need it," I protested, and soon ate up the vegetables and baked potato. "But Daddy says you must eat. Take it to your room and do not come down till it's gone." It was a beautiful Saturday, and it seemed unfair that I should be punished in this way. Every now and again my father would call up the stairs, "My boy, has the meat gone?" "No, father," I would have to admit. I looked across the lawn to my seed beds, where whole regiments of little trees were awaiting my attention, and as my eyes ranged nearer, I saw my kitten on the lawn just under my window. In a loud whisper, I called, "Kitty," and threw out that horrid slice of beef. She snapped it up. A great fear came over me. I crouched on the floor beside my bed in the corner, waiting in terror of what might happen next. After seemingly interminable time, the voice came again. "My boy, has the meat gone?" Yes, father," I called back, trembling. "Good boy, you may come down." I escaped to my little trees, and a hot tear dropped into the watering can, for I had deceived my father, whom I loved. I never had the courage to own up to what I had done. He had been obeyed, at least so he thought, and that was what mattered to him. He never tried to make me eat meat again, and I proved for myself that it was not necessary as a food. My health was good, I was strong, and as I grew up, I could walk or ride long distances. My father could not abide sectarianism, and each month held a united prayer meeting to which he welcomed ministers of all denominations. In the atmosphere of prayer, their religious differences vanished, for with their convener they all acknowledged the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. To his hospitable home came Hindus and Buddhists, Persian Sufis, devout followers of Islam, and missionaries on furlough. In the high summer of 1894, I had an unforgettable experience which, at the early age of 5, altered my outlook on life, and I believe more than anything influenced the way by which I have come. As I have already explained, my earliest and happiest memories are bound up with trees. One of the earliest is that of the pine forest which came up close to the house. I often sat in the sun there, and in the tree tops I seemed to hear the sound of waves breaking on the seashore. Those pines spoke to me of distant lands and gave me my first desire to travel and see the trees of other countries. At times I would imagine that these tall pines were talking to each other as they shook or nodded their heads at the whim of the winds. I did not know then that I would be at school with James Elroy Flecker, who once wrote, "For pines are gossip pines the wide world through." My old nurse, Perrin, was a real native of Hampshire. As a girl, she used to glean in the fields and get sufficient wheat, she told me, to keep them in bread for the year. She was married to a forester in charge of woodlands belonging to Queen's College, Oxford. These woodlands adjoined my father's estate, and from my earliest days my nurse took me for walks there. I loved the Perrin cottage. It was on a knoll on the fringe of the woods, and from it I could peer into the dark woods of dreamy, gloomy, friendly trees. That pine forest was full of romance and boyish adventure for me. A stone's throw from the cottage was a large brick oven where the weekly batch of bread was baked. I often watched spellbound to see the hot, sweet-smelling loaves removed from the oven. To me, Perrin was sort of high priestess officiating at her altar, and the scent of the burning gorse seemed like incense to me. When I was small, it was the huge sand pit that provided the greatest attraction for me. It was in full sight of the oven, and I usually played at treescaping. I collected twigs of pines broken off by squirrels or the wind and stuck them into mounds of sand. I planted an avenue leading up to a sandcastle, complete with drawbridge and moat. My early treescaping efforts were influenced to some extent by the attractive colored slides shown by my father. The surrounding woods were extensive, and in those days I never penetrated very far, nor would parent take me into the forest as a rule. To a small boy, their depths were mysterious and rather awe-inspiring. One day I found I had exhausted my ideas of treescaping in the sandpit, and so, greatly daring, asked if I might be allowed to go for a walk in the wood. Parents said the woods were full of adders at this time of the year, and no safe place for the likes of a small boy. But I coaxed her to let me go, and reluctantly she allowed me to set out on what seemed to me a wonderful expedition. No explorer of space probing the secrets of other planets could have felt more exultation than I did at that moment. As I set out on the greatest of all forest adventures, at first I kept to a path which wound its way down into the valley, but soon I found myself in a dense part of the forest where the trees were taller and the path became lost in bracken beneath the pines. Soon I was completely isolated in the luxuriant, tangled growth of ferns which were well above my head. In my infant mind, I seemed to have entered the fairyland of my dreams. I wandered on as in a dream, all sense of time and space lost. As I continued this mysterious journey, looking up every now and then, I could see shafts of light where the sunshine lit up the morning mists and made subtle shadows on the huge bracken fronds which provided a continuous canopy of bright green over me. Their pungent scent was a delight to me. Although I could see only a few yards ahead, I had no sense of being shut in. The sensation was exhilarating. I began to walk faster, buoyed up with an almost ethereal feeling of well-being, as if I had been detached from earth. I became intoxicated with the beauty around me, immersed in the joyousness and exultation of feeling part of it all. Soon the bracken became shorter, and before long it was left behind as a clearing opened where the dry pine needles covered the floor of the forest with a soft brown carpet. Rays of light pierced the canopy of the forest, were reflected on the ground mists, and appeared as glorious shafts interlaced with the tall stems of the trees, bright and dark threads woven into a design. I had entered the temple of the woods. I sank to the ground in a state of ecstasy. Everything was intensely vivid. The call of a distant cuckoo seemed just by me. I was alone, and yet encompassed by all the living creatures I loved so dearly. As I lay back, a dead twig snapped, like the crack of a whip. The birds warbling sounded like the notes of a cathedral organ. The overpowering beauty of it all entered my very being. At that moment, my heart brimmed over with a sense of unspeakable thankfulness which has followed me through the years since the woodland rebirth. My gratitude for this cosmic experience can be perhaps best expressed in the Scots metrical version of the 23rd Psalm. Goodness and mercy all my life shall surely follow me, and in God's house forevermore my dwelling place shall be. I was lost in the depths of the forest, but at that moment this did not dawn upon me. I was conscious of a feeling of bliss only once repeated in my childhood. The second experience was when my father, in a lantern lecture on Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, threw on the screen a picture of Beulah Land. With 150 others, I sang the hymn, "O Beulah Land, sweet Beulah Land, as on the highest mount I stand," and gaze away across the sea where mansions are prepared for me. I view the shining glory shore, my heaven, my home forevermore. In the wood among the pines, it seemed that for one brief moment I had tasted immortality, and in a few seconds had lived an eternity. This experience may last forever. Just beyond the tall pines was another trail where I turned to the left. In a few moments, I was back with Perrin and the commonplace things of daily life, the washing and the baking. But how everything in this short interval had changed. Even the clothes hanging out to dry on the line tied between two pines seemed like gay flags hung out for a coronation. I watched red-faced old Perrin taking out the most wonderful loaves from the brick oven. Close to her side, I walked home to the midday meal as if treading on air. I no longer minded the big black dog that used to bark so furiously at us. Even Raisy, the cross old gardener, looked like a favorite uncle to me. I seemed to sense the affection of my parents as never before. I was in love with life. I was indeed born again, although I could not have explained what had happened to me then. The next day, I went back to the woods. They now held a new and strange fascination for me. Perrin gave her consent more readily, but added her usual caution: keep out of harm's way. I used to wonder why it was that Perrin never seemed to want to go into the woods, and never encouraged me to venture very far. With her, it was always those adders, or the obidioi and the little folk. It was a bright sunny day, and this time I kept to the woodland path which brought me out to some younger plantations. I tried to find the place where I had been the day before, but though I must have been very close, it evaded me, nor did I again experience the rapture of the previous day. After a while, I used to explore different parts of the woods. I left the pines and ventured into a beech wood. On the fringe of the beeches, I could get a clear view of Winchester, 12 miles away. On good days, I could see St. Catherine's Hill, where we sometimes went for picnics near a clump of beeches. There was a huge maze cut in the ground, and I and my brother Scott used to race each other to the middle, which took about 8 minutes, and out again. We were told that it had been cut by a boy at Winchester School who had been kept back at the end of term as a punishment. It was said that he had cut this huge maze with his penknife, then died of a broken heart singing Dulce Domum. That story used to make me feel sad and unhappy. I entered into his distress at being prevented from returning home for the holidays. But when I was feeling unhappy, or if things had gone wrong for me during the day, I would leave the house, run down the little lane, cross the meadow, and visit a particular beech tree in the wood. That beech with smooth bark was a mother confessor to my Madonna of the woods. Standing by the friendly beech, I knew in my heart that my troubles and my grief, as well as all that pleased me, were but for a passing moment. I would imagine that I had roots digging down deep into Mother Earth, and that all above me I was sprouting branches. I would hold that in my thoughts for a few moments, and then come back with the strength of the tree and radiant heart, knowing that that was all that really mattered. John Masefield's inspired Terra Incognita in Lullington Downs and Other Poems, 1917, expresses my feeling. Here in the self is all that man can know, of beauty all the wonder, all the power, all the unearthly color, all the glow. Here in the self is all that man can know, of beauty all the wonder, all the power, all the unhealthy color, all the glow. Here in the self which withers like a flower. Here in the self which fades as hours pass, and droops and dies and rots, and is forgotten sooner by ages than the mirroring glass, in which it sees its glory still unrotten. Beauty herself, the universal mind, eternal April wandering alone, the God, the Holy Ghost, the atoning Lord, here in the flesh, the never yet explored. From that moment, life became exciting, and I entered with zest into the Sunday services and helped my father at the weeknight meetings. The mission hall on Beacon Hill opened its doors to the workless in the dark days of unemployment and became a shining spiritual beacon. Coffee suppers were served and illustrated talks on Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress listened to with rapt attention. By the age of 12, I was sometimes called upon to deputize for my father. In time, I and my brother Scott used to walk the 5 miles to Curdridge Church for the morning service, and some Sundays to Bittering, 2 miles in another direction, for the evening service. On my return after supper, my father would ask me to read Spurgeon's sermons to him. Having given out all day, he liked to hear a sermon from the Christian Herald, or perhaps an article on the prophecy from the English Churchman. Regularly once a month, the Reverend Melville Churchill, cousin of Sir Winston and erudite contributor to the English Churchman under the name of Inne Cantab, used to walk the 8 miles from his home in Bishop's Waltham to visit us. He was in sympathy with my father's evangelical work, and he too had built a mission hall. He had a weakness for the perfectly made mocha coffee my father had learned to make during the winters he had spent as a child in France. The books of Daniel and Revelation provided these earnest students of prophecy with dates which seemed to confirm past happenings and led them to look for future fulfillment. I was fascinated by their exciting conclusions when substituting a year for a day. Towards the end of the Boer War, when Mr. Churchill arrived for his monthly discussion, my father greeted him with, "That young cousin of yours in South Africa is a bit of a harum-scarum, isn't he?" "You might think so, John, but Winston keeps his parents with his war stories in the Daily Telegraph. Mark my word, John, one day he will be Prime Minister of England." Many were the famous preachers who visited my father to preach in the mission hall. I always remember General Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, discussing the progress of the soul with my father one Sunday evening after supper. The general maintained that backsliding would be forgiven twice, but never a third time. To illustrate his point, he knelt by a chair and, holding up his thumb and first 2 fingers, said, "Mr. Baker, here's the soul," while I watched with intense interest, taking for granted the soul was there. He placed his thumb and fingers on the chair and brought them across to somewhere near the middle and suddenly drew them back. "There, Mr. Baker," he said, "that's once." Again he advanced the imaginary soul to somewhere near the edge of the chair, then withdrew it, looking fiercely at my father. "That, Mr. Baker, is the second time." The third time he passed his fingers and thumb to the edge of the chair and brought them down to the floor with a thump. I was so hypnotized by the general and in sympathy with the poor soul, I too fell flat on my face on the floor. The general continued to lay down the law, while my father pleaded with him that God was able to forgive until 70 times 7. But the general would have none of this. He had his own rules for salvation. It was in this atmosphere that I was brought up to wait on the guests and run errands for my father. As the eldest of a family of 5, I became responsible at an early age. My first school was in the neighboring village of Bittering, which I walked to, making a shortcut through an adjoining property until I was 7, when I had my first bicycle, a heavy frame affair with cushioned tires. During the holidays, I went for long rides throughout the New Forest and our part of the country. One of our neighbors kept bees, and one day I watched him manipulate a hive. When he took out a bare frame covered with bees, I asked him to let me hold it. I was thrilled with the sight, and when I went home, I asked my father if he would give me a hive. After some days, when he found that my heart was set on keeping bees, he suggested that I might exchange some of my apple trees that I had myself grafted for a stock. This was when I was 12. By the time I was 16, I had become a proficient bee master with 16 hives, the best of which in a single season yielded me 240 pounds of honey. I built up my apiary with driven bees, which I rescued from the cottagers' sulfur pits. My modern bar-framed hives I had made in my own workshop after the model of the first one I had bought. I am always grateful to my parents for allowing me to have my own garden at an early age and build a little house of my own and later a revolving summer house for my mother. It seemed natural for me to do these things, and I would have felt frustrated if prevented. My father believed that whatever a man's profession, he should still be able to keep himself and his family by manual labor. I have proved for myself the soundness of this theory, having worked my way through 3 universities and been given an honorary degree at the first forestry school in the USA for my contribution in creating employment on the land for 6 million young men. I have always found it a distinct advantage to be able to show someone how to do a job instead of issuing orders on paper. There is another aspect of life on the land. While working in forest or garden, a man has time for meditation, and indeed his very act is devotion. He becomes in tune with the infinite. The miracle of growth and the seasons' changes induce a sense of wonderment and call forth worship from his inner being, and in this sense, work becomes worship. Although my father had had a tutor, he decided that if at all possible I should go to public school, and he was concerned that it should be one with evangelical tendencies. No doubt he discussed this with the Reverend Melville Churchill. So in 1902, when I was 13, I was sent to Dean Close School, Cheltenham. The headmaster was a German Jew by the name of Flecker, who had married a Russian Jewess. Both were clever. Their eldest son, James Elroy, became a poet and wrote Hassan. My dear boy, I do hope you have nothing to do with Elroy Flecker. His mother was unburdening her heart to me about the trouble he has been to her and his dear father. Elroy had already gone up to Oxford, but he brought cricket teams to play the school. After my mother's warning, I thought I would investigate for myself and become friendly with him, although he was rather a recluse. While I was at school at Cheltenham, I was fortunate enough to get to know the Elwes family at Colesburn, about 6 miles away in Cotswolds. It was a wooded estate of about 7,000 acres, and there I would often spend my half-term or good conduct holidays. The owner of these extensive woodlands was writing a book on trees of Great Britain and Ireland, assisted by Professor Henry, the Cambridge botanist, who had spent much time collecting rare species in China. Henry, too, would sometimes stay at Colesbourne, and I would be allowed to accompany them on their forestry and botanical expeditions. On one of these, Henry pointed out to Eloise rather a special variety of elm. He was not at all dogmatic, but only tentatively put this suggestion forward. I don't agree with you, said Eloise, whereupon Henry attempted to point out the very slight botanical variation and handed his pocket magnifying glass to Eloise so that he could better examine the flower of the tree for himself. I don't agree with you, Henry, repeated Eloise. Now, if you would only listen to me, and he gave his own opinion at some length. Naturally, Henry listened, but said no more. The following day I was walking alone with Eloise. As we came to the elm tree discussed on the previous day, Eloise took up a stance, undid his coat, hooked his thumbs in his waistcoat, faced the elm, and addressed me in rather a fierce tone of voice. Baker, this elm is not what you think it is. I have made a discovery. Far from being a common English elm, Ulmus campestris, this is likely to be related to the Huntingdon elm, and if you are not convinced that I am right, I would ask you to examine the flower, when you will discover for yourself that my opinion is correct. Had Eloise forgotten that I had listened to the argument the day before, or was it his way of instructing me on the identification of forest trees? Years afterwards, on my return from Africa, it was my good fortune to stay at Colborne with his son, Colonel Eloise, and become more intimate with the woodlands and the family. Many were the days I devoted to forestry there. While I was at Dean Close, a man came to talk about Canada. It was not what he said, but what he did that impressed itself on my mind. He wore a tall coat with stiff shirt and collar and ready-made white tie, and at one stage in his lecture he caught hold of his collar and shook it savagely and said, "Out in Canada, we don't have to wear these derned things. We wear soft collars or no collars at all." My mind was now made up. I must go to Canada. After 4 years, I discovered that my father was selling land to pay school fees for my education. He listened gravely when I told him that I knew of his sacrifices and that I wanted to leave school to go to Canada. Then an old-time pioneer, Bishop Lloyd, returned from the western prairies. I was introduced to him by an old friend of my father, Dr. Eugene Stock, secretary of the Church Missionary Society. Lloyd said he wanted men who would go out ahead of the railway and blaze the trail. He spoke of the scattered settlers far from the towns who had no means of grace, and appealed to me to throw in my lot with a group of undergraduates at Emmanuel College, Saskatchewan University, Saskatoon. I responded to the call, and for the next few months worked hard to equip myself some breakfast before leaving for Southampton, where I was learning how to make horseshoes from short lengths of wrought iron. One of my father's customers was a young fruit grower from Burridge, where my great-grandfather had owned much land which he had planted with trees. Young Roberts, the fruit grower, had bought some of this land where the timber had been felled and was having to grubbed ready for orchards and fruit gardens. I begged this man to allow me to go and camp with him and help him lay out his property. I wanted to sleep under the stars and get fit for the work in Canada that lay ahead of me. After the day's work was done, we would put on boxing gloves. In those days, I rather fancied that I could punch hard. Young Roberts was a fine specimen of muscular Christianity, and although I had a longer reach, he made me hop around. I was always grateful to him for putting me through my paces in preparation for the Northwest, and have treasured his friendship through the years. After 60 years, we still correspond. I had a letter from him at Frith Farm, Wickham, Hampshire, dated January 10th, 1969. "Not only did you cook for me, but you did the washing and you carted the fruit by horse and van, besides rushing about in the middle of the night and scaring that Mr. Miles who came down and slept in the tent with us, making out we were being attacked by robbers. And do you remember grinding the corn and making bread in that coal stove in the shed? Not only that, do you remember taking your little harmonium out in the Burridge Road and conducting a service each Sunday? You have always been a wonderful chap, full of good deeds and personality, and one could never keep you down. You come from a line of saints. I shall never forget your dear mother singing and playing on a little organ, There is no love like the love of Jesus. She played so beautifully, and she meant every word of it. Both your parents were saints when the time came for them to go, and I think if you had pursued this evangelistic work, you would have done very great work. I know what great satisfaction you have obtained from your parents. But to return to the story, for 3.5 years I was in the hard school of the open spaces. I homesteaded south of Saskatoon and pitched my tent on Beaver Creek, where in the small hours of the morning I took delight in watching the beavers. They constructed a dam along which I could walk. It was more than 140 feet wide when they had started building. In the winter, I returned and was thrilled to find a large beaver house, the top of which protruded there to 4 feet above the ice. It looked like the crater of a miniature volcano with hot air and steam rising from the summit, upon the fringes of which the snow had melted to become icicles. The beaver's dam had flooded about 12 acres of meadow. From then on, the beavers became my lasting friends, and I came to regard them as fellow foresters. As one of the first 100 students at Saskatchewan University, there are 12,000 students at the university at the time of writing, I was elected to a committee for drawing up a college yell. After much thought, we decided we must combine our colors with the name of the university. This was the result. Saskatchewan, Saskatchewan, Varsity, Hi Hickety Ki, Hi Hickety Ki, Dio et Dio et Patri, the green and white, Kiyam I ki, Saskatchewan. As sophomores, we had the privilege of initiating the freshmen, and in my sophomore year, one of the freshmen was Diefenbaker, afterwards Prime Minister of Canada. My knowledge of horses was my best introduction to the Redskins, among whom social status was governed by the quality of their horsemanship. They were proud of their horses and always insisted that I rode their best. There was a happy rivalry between these friendly Indians, who each claimed that they had the best horse. Those were my bronco-busting days. In England, they talk of breaking a horse, while in France they use the verb dresser, or to finish a horse. It is a pity that the Old English term to gentle a horse is so rarely used, and I prefer the word make to break. In the haute école, much attention is given to finding the center of gravity of a horse, or adjusting one's own weight so that the horse can enjoy perfect balance. This is the opposite of rodeo, when horses are tortured with a strap or rope drawn tight under the belly so that they play up and buck to get rid of the rider. Like many another tenderfoot, I had a go at riding untamed broncos, and once when in Pleasant Valley, Alberta, I had a beautiful black Montana bronco promised to me if I could ride him. He was one of a bunch of about 80 wild mustangs and had twice jumped the corral close on 7 feet high. The boss had turned to me with a curse and exclaimed, "Say, boy, if you can ride that damned black devil, it's yours." That afternoon, I rode him 25 miles and returned the next day to claim him and thank his owner for a wonderful gift. He was the best journey horse I have ridden, and was a fast canter relieved every now and again by a dod-and-carry one tit-up. I traded beautiful green Hudson Bay blankets with the Indians for horses and arrived in college with 6 of them plus a load of hay. I built a barn on the university campus and a shack nearby. My ponies were my best friends, and they helped me pay my way through college. I shared my shack with 2 other university students and contributed a page each week to the Saturday Press to buy a meal ticket at a Chinese restaurant. In the autumn of 1910, while crossing the prairies of Canada, I recognized for the first time a desert in the making. Wide areas had been plowed up where for centuries dwarf willows had stabilized the deep, rich black soil. The country had been divided into townships with sections of 640 acres. In those days, anybody could file onto a quarter section of 160 acres for nothing, and if he needed more, that could be acquired. The first thing they did was to plow as much of it as they could, then sow wheat and oats to feed the horses. One could travel miles without seeing a tree. When a farmer took up a section of land, he would mark the boundary, put up a couple of poles with strips of an old white shirt tied on the tops so that they could be seen a mile away, sit on the low with his 6-horse outfit, and drive straight, keeping the markers between the herds of the leading horses backwards and forwards on dead level ground, breaking 5 acres a day. 2 crops of wheat would be grown and then a crop of oats. His neighbor would be doing the same. With no sheltering trees, the soil began to drift and blow away. Up to an inch of soil would be lost in a year. Years afterwards, my secretary, Finlayson, told me of a Dorset farmer who decided to go to Saskatchewan. He took up land, dug a cellar, and built a frame house on top of it, plowed up the prairie, and grew wheat and oats. After 20 years, he decided the country was no good for farming, for 8 feet of his soil had gone, and he had to climb up into his house. He could not sell, so left it derelict and returned to Dorset, where he became a tenant farmer once again with tree-surrounded fields. During my 3.5 years in the northwest of Canada, I encouraged the planting of trees, not only around the homesteads, but as shelter belts around the farms and fields. On the Saskatchewan University farm at Sutherland and at Medicine Hat, we had nurseries and experimented with various species to get the best shelter. The government gave trees freely to farmers. It was while working in a lumber camp near Prince Albert, swinging the axe as a lumberjack, that my heart was torn to see the unnecessary waste of trees, and I decided that one day I would qualify myself for forestry work. Having earned enough to return to England, I was studying divinity at Ridley Hall, Cambridge, at the outbreak of World War I. While at Emmanuel College, Saskatchewan, taking arts and science, I had devoted myself to Christian work in the Northwest and in the building up of congregations of isolated settlers around the central schools of mission churches. I felt that before accepting ordination, I should gain wider experience and perhaps complete my studies at Cambridge, where generations of my forebears had taken their degrees or had become fellows of their colleagues. Into the peace and seclusion of Ridley Hall came the threat of war. I had taken to heart the Sermon on the Mount and sought the guidance of my tutor, for whom I had the greatest possible admiration. If the teachings of Jesus meant anything, and if we were to take up his cross and follow him, it would mean throwing up my cavalry training in King Edward's horse, the King's Overseas Dominions Regiment, and becoming a conscientious objector to war with all the deprivation it would entail. My tutor, however, explained that the Sermon on the Mount was a counsel of perfection, and obviously we could hardly expect to be able to live up to it yet. Besides, Jesus himself fought the money changers in the temple and would wish his followers to steel themselves for the fight against evil. He said, "I came not to bring peace by a sword." Somewhat bewildered, this young divinity student decided to go to the summer camp with his regiment. 2 weeks later, war came, and in response to an appeal, I volunteered for immediate service overseas. That was towards the end of the summer, in August 1914. I had joined up as a trooper in King Edward's horse, but it was with the guns that I saw most of my service in France, For just as I had made up my mind that the best way to die was in a cavalry charge, I was promoted and given a commission in the Royal Horse and Field Artillery. I had expected to be drafted to France the next day, but instead I was posted to a reserve battery in Ireland. Here I had 600 horses, 2 guns, and 800 wild Irish reservists to be equipped and trained for overseas service and taught to ride horses. It was sheer fun for me, for I was in my element. I taught my men to ride in the hunting field with the Muskerry and Duhallow, the nearest packs to my station at Ballincollig. For the moment, it was all so enjoyable that we almost forgot the war, but the time soon came for me to leave. After passing out 800 drivers for France, I followed. I was the first temporary officer in the 1st Divisional Artillery of the Old Army, for I relieved the first officer casualty in 115 Battery, 25th Brigade. My battery commander was Ronnie Carrington, whose name was a byword as a gunner with the highest possible reputation. When other gunners in the 1st Division were rationed to 25 rounds per battery per day, he was allowed 3,000 rounds on account of his phenomenal marksmanship. 115 was a poker-playing battery, but having learnt my lesson on my way to Canada, I would excuse myself from joining in and go out into the gun line to spot the flashes from German guns as they were being fired behind their lines. I recorded the angle of these from the gun line so that the Air Force observers could fly over the next day and give us the range. My services were recognized by the authorities, and in due course a military cross arrived for me. But Ronnie Carrington did not approve of decorations and said, "Baker, you don't want to have a ribbon all over your bosom, do you? You're out here to kill Germans. That's our job, isn't it?" And he sent the cross back to the brigade headquarters. When General Fanshawe wrote to the major inviting me to be his ADC, Ronnie, handing the letter to me, impatiently exclaimed, "You don't want to go and polish the general's buttons for him, do you? Aren't you here to kill Germans?" So I stayed with my battery while Teddy Schreiber, who accepted, was soon promoted rapidly to brigadier and later major general. I was fond of General Fanshawe, known to us as Fanny. He too was a crack gunner and keenly interested in what was happening at the front. Twice a week he would come to my forward observation post and ask me if there was anything new. He had a weakness for strawberries and cream, and I used to send my Batman to the midnight market at Bethune to secure those delicacies and bring them to me by dawn, when a visit from Fanny was expected. On one of these exciting mornings, I happened to mention that a slit in the church spire of Labassy would get light and then dark again. My telescope was focused on this slit, and the general kept watch. A few minutes later, he exclaimed excitedly, "You're right, Baker. There's obviously an observation post there. Get your guns onto it." I must admit, I felt a bit squeamish about shelling a church, and suggested that he should get the heavies onto it. This he did, and for 2 days the heavies kept up fire without hitting the object. The church was just on the other side of the hill and in a fairly safe position. As I was watching at dawn on the third morning, there was a terrific explosion, and when the rubble and dust cleared from the air, the church spire had gone. I told the general this when he came round a few minutes later, and he said, "What about a spot of leave, Baker? There's going to be a big push soon, so I won't suggest more than 4 days. How about it?" Of course I accepted. In London, I was invited to a tea party by some friends, all anxious for the latest news from the front. One old lady who confronted me said, "Isn't it terrible that those Germans are firing at churches behind our lines?" I kept very quiet. On my return to France, I was posted to the 39th Brigade under the command of Colonel Wardrop, the famous authority on pig sticking, who had written a book on the subject, which had become a classic. The Corps' horse show was in the offing, and he asked me if I was going to enter. I regretted that I had not a horse fit to enter, and so he very generously invited me to ride his chestnut, a fine upstanding charger. As good fortune would have it, I won the Corps Cup on his horse. After this, I was given the very responsible job of building a fighting post for the colonel in preparation for the big push. In the middle of this job, the Germans sent over 40 heavy shells in 5 minutes, and 27 of us were buried beneath bricks and mortar and sandbags. The corpses were extracted from the debris and laid in an improved mortuary. The corporal in charge of the burial party was collecting the identity discs, ripping them off the necks of the corpses. But my identity badge was chained onto my wrist. This had to be done during my recent 4 days' leave. The corporal gave it a tug and tried to break the steel chain without success. The wrist started bleeding, whereupon he called the sergeant and reported, "This corpse is bleeding." The sergeant said, "Put it on that old Ford," referring to the van that had brought up the burial tools. This corpse woke up there, and a half-days later in the Duchess of Westminster Hospital at La Touquet, Paris, Plage. Although my body was badly hurt and many bones were broken, I do not remember feeling any pain. It seemed that I myself was outside my body, quite detached from it, watching it with interest, yet I do not remember feeling any pain. That must have lasted for about 3 days. I was haunted by the thought of having taken life. In the fury of the war and in retaliating for the loss of so many of my comrades, quite apart from the destruction by my guns, I had taken a heavy toll of German officers from the sniper's post where I would claim my daily turn. In my war madness, I used to carve a notch for each heart shot on an old bow I had found in a shelled chateau, and with glowing pride I had filled it from tip to tip. A soldier's tribute to his king, displayed in every ruddy ring. In hospital, from each notch, the eyes of those officers I had killed seemed to look sadly out at me. Their ghostly specters haunted me. I could not sleep, and my heart came near breaking with regret. There about 4 o'clock one morning, I thought I saw my former major, Bob Herman of cavalry, who had been killed by a stray bullet a few days before, come into my room and stand looking at me from the bottom of my bed. This vision saved my sanity. In order to comfort others, I tried to record this impression in the words of a young officer who has been killed and appears to his mother. She has just had news of his death and is going round her room examining his souvenirs, little bits of twisted bullet and fragments of shell he had brought her when on leave from the front. Her heart is seared with grief until he enters her room. "Mother, I have come for one brief moment. I must not tarry longer. Promoted I have been, no longer earthbound sorrowing. I pass from sphere to sphere, carrying new messages of love. No longer hate I now. Eyes that once were filled with feud now shine bright with gratitude. Yonder I go to join my comrades, regret not the past, live in the present, crowd each hour with gladness. Out of the sorrow, out of the sadness, spring a new world into birth. Soon strife shall surely cease, and earth with settled peace break into song." He then vanishes as silently as he has come. A great weight is lifted from his mother as she begins to realize the meaning of life after death. And so it was with me. Instead of those Germans being my enemies, they became the shining ones, overflowing with gratitude for their promotion into heavenly places. Slowly, consciousness returned, and I began to recover, though I still suffered both mental as well as bodily agony as if I were thawing out after having been frozen. Strangely enough, it is not the freezing that hurts, it is the thawing out which is excruciating. I wanted to die, but with great skill I was dragged back to life, and eventually I returned to the front, only to be smashed up again. In the summer of 1917, I was stationed at Swathling Remount Depot near Southampton and used to receive horses from conditioning depots to take on to France. I made 58 crossings of the English Channel and conducted 18,000 horses, sometimes as many as 450 on a boat, taking them to Le Havre deep and sometimes into a smaller boat to Rouen. I used to look forward to those summer days on the boat, going up the Seine and being greeted by children lined up along the banks to see the horseboat pass on its way to the front. It was generally peaceful once we crossed the channel. Unfortunately, once as we were entering the mouth of the Seine, and just as our escort had given his farewell toot and swung round to go out to sea again, she struck a mine, was split in the middle, and sank in our stern. In those channel crossings, I generally contrived to have blood mare on the top deck just outside my cabin in case our ship was torpedoed. A horse as a swimming companion in the water is better than a lifeboat, for besides being a friend in distress, a clever horse has the instinct to swim towards the nearest land. I would choose a horse with a mane that I could hold on to. When swimming with a horse, it is important to keep one's legs as near the surface of the water as possible and away from the horse's feet. Once, when returning empty, we struck a mine in mid-channel, and the Lascar stokers went on strike, so I ordered my remount conducting party to carry on. They brought the ship into Southampton, and I got a DCM for my sergeant. Soon I had become so fit on this light duty that I was posted to the remount depot at Deep, and used to take horses up the line from there. This was done under cover of night, and we usually managed to hand over before dawn and get the horses dispersed to their units before the German planes were up. However, on one of these trips to the front, a dive bomber dropped a string on the train which was blown up just as we were shunting back. That was the last time I was smashed up, and after the wounds had healed, I was fortunate enough to be invited to stay at Linnell Coldstream as a guest of Lady Clementine Waring. It was a beautiful wooded property, and I was able to help the woodmen and fend for the other officers who had suffered loss of limb. I was finally invalided out in April 1918. I am deeply appreciative of the skill of the doctors and devoted care of the nurses, and sometimes wish that I could arrange a grand reunion of all those to whom I am indebted for my life. During my convalescence, it began to dawn upon me that we were losing more lives through ignorance of health in our great cities than on all fronts. With Percy Alden of the British Institute of Social Service, I devoted my work for the government, calling upon captains of industry to enlist their help and generally paving the way for the Ministry of Health. It was my earnest endeavor to see that wonderful wartime sacrifice should not be wasted, and that out of it should come a new and saner order of things leading to a lasting peace. As soon as the Ministry of Health came into being, I returned to my forestry work at Cambridge.